Hello, welcome to the first Bridgecast. I'm here with Nick Reinhardt-Swierk, who's the co-chair of our board of directors. This is a time that is a little uncertain for us as a whole. So as you can see, we're practicing social distancing as much as Nick and I like to be in community together, and we'd like to be actually here in person. We're doing our best to sort of stay apart, and so we have Nick streamed in here. We're going to just kick it off, and we're going to start by asking Nick a couple of questions. Nick, would you sort of introduce the community activist work and the community organizing work you do in St. Louis?
Sure. So my name is Nikki Reinhardt-Swierk. I am a native St. Louis resident, and I've been a activist and community organizer, I guess, for 11 or 12 years now. In St. Louis, I used to work in Ferguson. I worked at Wellspring United Methodist Church, which was the church that's just catty corner from the Ferguson Police Department. So I worked at that church, and then the nonprofit that church opened up, the Center for Social Empowerment, where I was associate director for 3.5 years. In that capacity, we were kind of known as a Black Lives Matter church, and I did social uplift work as well as activist work, working with conversations across difference, so trying to talk about issues like race and sexuality and class across those divisive barriers in order to build more cohesive communities. Unfortunately, the church that I worked at shut down, and the nonprofit moved with the pastor to Ohio. So then I got a new job working at Manchester United Methodist Church, which is a big, pretty affluent church out in West County, St. Louis. And there I am their coordinator of social justice ministries and director of young adult ministries. So at the church, as a social justice coordinator, I organize justice initiatives and activities like educational events. We do a tutoring program with Peabody Elementary School in the city. And then we do classes and that kind of stuff to educate and activate our West County folks to get more engaged in justice work. And then with the young adults in St. Louis, I run a group called Shared Streets STL, which is an alternative ministry opportunity for young adults. So we work with folks 18 through 35, and we have a very kind of particular activist and community building perspective. And the great thing about that group is it's one of the largest and most diverse kind of collection of young adults in a religious community that I know of in our jurisdiction.
Thank you. And so that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on here is your profound work within the city of St. Louis, working with levels of oppression that we'll talk about a little bit later, and young adults, which is our main sort of demographic as Bridge Builders STL. The next question, one of our main focuses with Bridge Builders is community building. In your opinion, what would be the one most important factor when it comes to community building?
Yeah, for me, community building requires authentic and vulnerable interactions, right? So in our kind of daily society, as we go through life, we have these kinds of circles of comfort with folks, right? So it's a concentric circle, and on the inside, I have, my family, my closest friends. These are people who I know a lot about. I know their hopes, I know their fears, I know their anxieties, that kind of stuff. And then as we go out in our circle, we know less and less about each rung, right? So my acquaintances, I might know who's in their family, what they like to drink or eat, what they do for work, but I don't necessarily know those more deep things. And then at the outer rings of the circles are those who we don't interact with. We typically don't know anything about them other than what we can just kind of automatically see or perceive. So when we try to do community building, too often folks throw people in a room together and just presume that we can build community from there.
Yeah.
Because we're not used to interacting with people on the outside of our circles with the same amount of authenticity as we do on the inside of our circles, right? So we don't really bring our whole true selves to every place we go. But community building requires us to, 1, know our whole selves, 2, be willing to share our whole selves with someone else, and 3, be willing to have someone else share their whole selves with them. Because the biggest kind of block to community building I see is this kind of assumption of knowledge. No matter who we are in a place where we assume things about ourselves and other people, right? So I can be so woke that I assume I don't need to hear about race anymore because I know about it. But that's not true because I'm a white person. And if I'm honest, I can never know everything about race. I've never experienced racism in the way a black person in the United States has, right?
Yeah.
But I can't assume that I know enough that I don't have to interact with the other. But then I also can't assume that like everyone's life experience is similar to mine, right? It's really easy for us as humans to like, well, I worked hard to get here, so I assume that anyone else can work hard and get here too, right? So like, I want other people to behave the way I behave because I'm assuming their lives look like mine. And community building requires us to decenter ourselves and say, this is my subjective experience, so that we can then learn from others what their experience is like and actually get to know them and their life. Because we can't community build if all we know about each other is what music we listen to and what we like to eat, right? We need to deep, intense things. What are you afraid of? What are you uncomfortable with? What can we work on together?
Thank you. And I think that really ties in well with what we're trying to achieve with Bridge Builders. And I know that in your time of coming on as co-chair with the board of directors, you have definitely brought a new perspective to the organization itself. How do you see Bridge Builders STL playing into that important factor of community building?
Yeah, so I think I'm really excited to be involved with Bridge Builders, and I kind of improvement and liberation of all. It's not us going somewhere to help someone. And too often when we want to be helpful, we tell other people what they need or we assume what they need, right? So instead of empowering folks, we end up trying to help and disempowering. And I appreciate that Bridge Builders is about getting to know different communities, coming to understand how different life experiences affect us, and then listening to those who have needs that are different from our own in order to figure out how to continue to react. I also appreciate the kind of longevity of a program like Bridge Builders. It's not, okay, we did our trip for 2 weeks and that's it. This is opportunity and organization that's about the transformation of individuals in order to transform communities. It's not just our goal to change the individual that goes on the trip. It's our goal to create a new community and to give all the members in this experience the tools, resources, and knowledge they need to continue doing this community building wherever they may end up in their personal and professional lives.
And you have been pretty crucial in our exchange team for this year. One of the things that you talked to our exchange team about at their first exchange team meeting was your theories and knowledge on the levels of oppression. Would you mind sharing a little bit what you shared with the team on levels of oppression?
Sure, I would love to. And just to put in the little kind of promoting myself, you can find more information about these level of oppression in a book I wrote, Holding Up Your Corner, youth resource. It is the youth version of a book that my former boss, F. Willis Johnson, wrote about race conversations in your church. So my theory of levels of oppression, each one of us interacts with every oppressive system, such as racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, right? We all interact with those problematic thought patterns that our society has given us. It might be unconscious, it might be conscious, but like we're all living in the cultural soup, and so that soup informs us all. So we have 3 different ways that we can potentially engage with these systems of oppression. And the first one is the one that happens across the board to everyone, and that's our internal processes, right? So internally, we interact with systems of oppression through our biases, right? And biases can usually be unconscious. With a lot of work and reflection and accountability partners, we can start to become aware of our own biases. But we all have them, right? And our biases are things that we don't think about, that come from that cultural soup, that make us act in a way we wouldn't want to. For example, I was raised in the United States and had grandparents who loved those crime shows, so I've seen Law and Order be repeated over and over at my grandparents' house. Most of the time in Law and Order, the perpetrator is a large black man. So as I, as a city resident, am walking down the street at night, I might see a large black man walking towards me and grab my purse more firmly, right? Whether or not I'm aware of doing it. So that's an unconscious activity. The cultural lesson I've gotten is a black man may be dangerous. My response without thinking is I've got to watch my stuff because he might be a burglar. Now, biases come from the lizard part of our brain, from the fight or flight part that's trying to keep us alive, right? So it has this psychological function of our brain looks at a situation and tries to see and find and assess a threat quickly, right? Biases just happen. The problem is when our societal messaging takes over our logic when it comes to biases. Now, I've had this talk before with diverse communities, and I've had some folks respond, well, I'm a black person, I can't have biases against black folks. And that's not true, actually. There's this amazing study, the implicit bias study at Harvard University. You can Google it. And it's this psychological study which has you clicking buttons really quick to trick your brain so that it can measure your unconscious thoughts. And what this survey is finding is a majority of people have a bias towards straight white men because our society has a bias towards straight white men. So whether or not we mean to, we can kind of replicate those systems. So that's the first thing. That's the stuff that happens inside our brain, doesn't necessarily get out into the world. The second level is that interpersonal, right? So we already did internal, now we do interpersonal. So interpersonal is where we see prejudice being acted out. So prejudice, for example, a black young man comes into a store, the white store owner watches the black young man as he's going through the store, trying to make sure that he's not stealing anything, right? So now the clerk's behavior has changed. They are acting in a social situation with another person based on these prejudices, these understandings or stereotype of an entire group of folks. And we can have prejudices that go kind of across a bunch of different lines. And when we talk about racism, sometimes we're talking about personal prejudice, right? And I think that can be a little confusing. I'll talk a little more at the end about that kind of system. But so we have biases that are internal, prejudices that are me when I'm interacting with another person. It's important to note that prejudices can go both ways. So there are totally people of color who are prejudiced against white folks based on kind of history of communities, right? So if you're part of a community where you've seen other people act oppressively most of the time, you might develop a prejudice, a stereotype of what a white person is, right? So I would argue that reverse racism does not exist, but prejudice can go in every direction. So finally, the last level, I have the internal, interpersonal, and then we have the structural, systematic level. This is the level where we're talking about economics and government and politics, like all these big kind of large things. And this to me is where racism or any other ism is: classism, racism, sexism, heterosexism. This is where power starts to get involved. So for example, an owner of a company is hiring new workers. We know statistically Jason is more likely to be hired than Jamal, right? Because a white sounding name is more likely to be hired than a black sounding name, all other things equal. Another example could be a country club that doesn't want to allow in people of color. Another example could be mandatory minimums for crack cocaine, which are higher than for coke, right? These are structural things that create inequality and punish people with less power. If you're an individual with power, you can do all three of these things. So, for example, I run a ministry. I could have a bias against a certain population. I could act personally prejudiced towards people of a certain identification. And then because I am a religious leader, how I act could also be on that structural level, right? I could be perpetrating racism on behalf of the church because that's me using my power in a way that's detrimental. Now, all of this is really important because when we talk about racist or racism, that's a buzzword that stops conversation entirely now, right? Because when you think of racist, there's a lot of different things you can think of, but the thing I get most often coming back to me in workshops is people think of the KKK, right? So if you try to say like, oh, that thing you said was racist, well, I'm not a flag burner, I don't hate Black people, right? So our problem is when we use terms like racist, racism, we go all the way to this kind of most extreme, which falls into this fallacy that racism is something that just happens from bad people, right? That bad people are racist, which is not true. Racism is a system that we are all living under, and it affects all of us, no matter who we are. It's up to us to figure out how we're interacting with these systems and to work on our perspectives so that we can get to know others and challenge these stereotypes. So my push, kind of closing out with levels of oppression, is not to just rely on terms like racist or sexist, but to say bias or prejudice. Those remarks were kind of prejudiced, or talk about the systematic parts of racism, because unfortunately when we use the word racist, that's an excellent way to shut down every conversation.
Yes, and thank you for sharing. I think that was something that spoke wonders to the work that we're doing, especially within the exchange team, to talk about the different levels of oppression that exists within communities that we are currently in and communities that we are going to be engaging in community in, looking at the historical context and the current context of how those oppression and levels of racism and systematic oppression affects those communities. So thank you. My next question is going to be, we are currently in the midst of a pandemic. We are obviously not visiting face-to-face, and for many people watching, it's difficult for them to see one another, to engage in community still. What would be one thing that you would say that we can do as a community towards community building in this time of pandemic?
Yeah, so I think community building is super, super important during this time of pandemic because we are feeling so isolated. And part of this, us all feeling so isolated, being frustrated by being stuck at home, is we're recognizing just how important community is, right? Sometimes in my work, it feels like I'm combating against busy schedules and technology that keeps me, casually connected to people far away, so I don't feel like I need community here. And this moment is reminding us just how desperately we need one another, and we need to connect with one another. So one thing that I've been doing during this time is organizing solidarity circles, which I've now kind of renamed conversation circles. I forget sometimes that my language gets a little too political. But conversation circles are ways that we can organize with our friends and communities in order to assure care. So a conversation circle would be different than just a phone call catch up, because I am intentionally trying to engage on deep things. So my conversation circles involve, like, do you have enough groceries for this week and next week? How are you feeling? How is your body? Have you had enough water to drink today? Have you gone outside today? Who are 2 more people you can call today to check in on, right? Because it can be tempting just to, like, hey, let's jump online and have a glass of wine or play a video game. But really what we need right now is ways to process what's happening. And really we can only process what's happening with other people. And the beautiful thing about this is I think that if we are intentional about creating these networks of interaction and community, especially across barriers of difference now, those communities will explode once we're able to join into one another again in person. So for example, we've got I've been setting up intergenerational conversation groups at the church that are just right now working out because old ladies whose husbands have died are stuck at home, and young folks who are in college are stuck at home alone. And then creating community between those 2 people is allowing them to support each other through the experience of being in isolation and being in lockdown by yourself. But it's also opening up all of these other beautiful possibilities for exchange of knowledge and understanding. I know that already our young people have become more patient with some of our older folks as they deal with technology. Our older folks have a greater appreciation for the kind of millennial perspective of questioning and moving quickly. So yeah, I just think that creating the networks of vulnerability and authenticity now will allow us to do even more later.
I really agree as well, and that's something that I think myself I need to be more pushing on in the circles that I'm involved with, so thank you for leading the way on that. My last question for today is going to be, what is going to be your goal when we can all join in community again? As a community organizer yourself, what is going to be your new focus towards a community organization?
Yeah, so you asked me this question right before we went on live, and my immediate response was like, ooh, that's a question, because it really is. And I'm not sure yet I have specific goals for community organizing after this is all over, because I don't think we know yet what this all is going to be, right? Like, especially for those of us who are young and at the beginning of our careers or still in school, it's kind of like, okay, well, once we get through the quarantine and the disease is over, like, then things will go back to normal, or, then school will be back to normal. But the reality is we don't know what life is going to look like when this is over, especially in Missouri, where we don't always have the best safety nets. So we don't know how many small businesses are going to go out of business. We don't know how many people will be unemployed. We don't know how much of our population is going to be gone. We don't know how many people will be grieving. But what we do know is that there's going to be a lot of need. There's going to be a lot of need for connection, a lot of need for sharing. So my focus right now is using the technology, as I'm being forced to create frameworks and structures that will help us to do really awesome community organizing when we meet. For example, I've got kind of databases for these conversation circles, which will be easily transferred into, for example, an unemployment support group if necessary. Because we're looking at a recession on top of a pandemic, right? So we have to be ready for the potential that our everyday life is going to drastically change. And as a community organizer, we can't necessarily prepare for what that's going to look like, but we're the people who should be able to bring people together once we're ready to get moving, right? Because it's our job as community organizers to see the need and to provide structure and resource for others to fill those needs. It's not our job as community organizers to fix everything for everyone. It's our job to help other people come together and do what they want. So I'm just focusing on structure and then trying to pay really close attention to what's going on so that I can start to guess what the needs are going to be. But mostly right now I'm trying to respond to people's loneliness, and then once we're not lonely, we'll figure out what problems we got.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, Nick, and thank you for offering your wisdom in this regard in community organization and community building. I look forward to our future. I look forward to where we can continue to build community in new and genuine and authentic ways. And I'm really appreciative you're on our board of directors. It's great to have people like you.
Thanks for having me. Before I sign off, I'm going to do a real quick plug. If you are a young adult who seems interested in the kind of activist-y, churchy stuff that I do, Shared Streets is half religious, half not. Check us out on Instagram, Shared Streets STL. Also, we have a Facebook group that you can request to join. We are not meeting in person, obviously, right now, but we're still doing social media stuff and connecting digitally. So if you are looking for another community, we would love to have you.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for joining us on the first Bridgecast, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.